people who are more isolated, lonely, less connected, those people stay in a kind of low-level fight or flight mode of chronic stress, higher levels of stress hormones circulating in their bodies, higher levels of inflammation all the time.
When we decide to work in the field of health and we go to a university and we're passionate about the subject, ironically, we're not really taught about health. We're taught about disease and dysfunction. That's kind of where we get focused and we get tunnel vision focused on those things. And so the idea of having a good state of health is really unconsciously becomes the absence of disease. But health is so much more than that. So your work is so powerful. And I'm curious, what got you interested in studying what actually creates health and the study of happiness?
Well, it started in 1938. And so I wasn't around, but the original study director was interested in the fact that we spend so much time looking at what goes wrong in life and in our bodies. So what if we looked at what goes right? And one of his patients was W.T. Grant, who was the department store magnate. You may not be old enough to remember there were W.T. Grant department stores. And Mr. Grant said he would fund a study of normal development because he wanted to know which people would be the ideal department store managers. So he funded a study of normal adolescents going into young adulthood. And now it turned out he funded a study of all Harvard College undergraduates, all white males from Harvard. So politically incorrect, but that was his idea of a normal developmental sample.
Holy moly. And so what personally tied you into that?
For me, I've always been fascinated by what makes us all tick, about, the human experience. So when I was an undergrad, I majored in history of science, and the things I wanted to study were why people thought crazy things and did crazy things, and try to get into the mindset of the time and understand, well, how could people do these things? How could people believe these things? And then, like witchcraft, I studied Salem witchcraft. Why did they think that there were witches in their midst in these small towns in New England? And then when I got to med school, I found I was really interested in psychiatry because I was most interested in how people's minds worked. And then I got into Zen meditation and started spending time sitting on a cushion, watching my own mind. And again, really studying this experience of being a human being alive in the world. So when I had the opportunity to take over this study that had tracked hundreds, now thousands of lives for so many years, I thought this would be the coolest thing to devote my time to. And so I said yes when they asked me if I wanted to take it over.
Holy moly. And this is, again, it's such a lengthy time span. Can you put that in context for us? Because a lot of times doing a study like this, it doesn't go according to plan, I would imagine, especially a lengthy study. There's cross-sectional versus longitudinal. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Most research is cross-sectional. So, for example, they might study depression in people now, and they might take a snapshot of 20-year-olds who are depressed and 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds. And then they would say, okay, this is how depression happens over the lifespan. But that can be misleading. And the best way to explain it is through a joke. There was a senator from Florida, Claude Pepper, and he once said, when I look at South Florida, I would have to believe that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish. The idea is that when we do this cross-sectional stuff, we make assumptions that may not be true at all about how life really progresses for people. So this is so unusual that a single study of the same people has lasted 85 years.
Yeah. And that, even with that joke, it's like you taking a snapshot at the beginning versus later on in life, and the population is completely different.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. and versus a longitudinal study, which is what essentially?
A longitudinal study starts with a group of people and goes back to them again and again and asks many similar questions, asking, how are you doing now? And then 2 years later, how are you doing now? Every 2 years, we would do that. We'd send people a questionnaire. Every 5 to 10 years, we'd go to their houses and interview them. We did all these different measures to try to track the big things about life: mental health, physical health, work life, relationships. And what we've done as science has changed, we've changed our methods. So we're studying the same big questions, but with different methods, like DNA. So we now study DNA. We draw blood for DNA. We look at epigenetics. In 1938, DNA wasn't even dreamed of. We put people into the MRI scanner and watch how their brains light up in different ways as we challenge them. None of this was imagined when the study started.
This is so powerful because what you have and what you're part of is really the longest running study to date that we are even aware of in any field. And it's really focused on human wellness and what constitutes a good life. And it's so remarkable because going back to the beginning, it was actually a merging of two different sets of participants. Let's talk about that.
That's right. So I talked about this group of Harvard College undergraduates, 19-year-olds. But then we also had a study, a separate study of kids from some of the not just poorest but most troubled families in the city of Boston in 1938. Families plagued by parental mental illness, domestic violence, alcoholism, all kinds of problems. And the study was started by people who asked the question, why are some children who are born into such difficult circumstances able to have good developmental paths? How do they end up staying out of trouble? And that was the interesting question for them. And so then we combined those two studies, a very privileged sample and a very underprivileged, under-resourced group of people. And then eventually we brought in women, all the spouses, and then all the children, half of whom are women. And the study has some people who were immigrants. About half of our original inner city sample were immigrant families, Middle East, Eastern Europe. So a fair amount of diversity, but not racial diversity. There are no people of color in the study because in 1938, the city of Boston was 97.4% white. And so that's what you get if you want to start a study in 1938 in Boston.
Yeah. And over time, even with your growing awareness and intentions, new testing modalities, new questions, new ways to analyze things, new ways to be inclusive as well, it's continuing to flower. And it's so cool because essentially you've been passing the torch down with this study. Why would it be so complicated to keep a study going so long?
Yeah. What happens is that too many people drop out of the study. So let's say I start with 100 people, but 5 years later, only 50 are left. And then 10 years later, only 20 are left. Scientifically, it's of no use to us anymore because too many people have dropped out. We don't know what's happened to the people who we're not in contact with anymore. In our study, over 80% of the original people stayed in the study for these 85 years. I mean, that's what's amazing to us. And it took the determination of my predecessors that we send people birthday cards. We send people thank you notes when they fill out a questionnaire. When they come to us and they need help, like if they need a doctor or they need somebody to talk to, we find them that help. So we're not a hands-off study. And I think that's what's helped people feel like they're part of a community.
It should seem obvious, just being more personable and caring.
Yeah.
It's a special ingredient. And so obviously, again, there's such a wealth of knowledge to see here. And you've got this diverse group as far as their backgrounds, their financial state, their culture that they're existing in. But over time, you see things kind of unfold and tell a certain story. And what you think coming into it, like as far as our goals and aspirations in life when we're younger, can you talk about what that is versus what you found to be most attractive and most desired for people later in life, and what actually constitutes a good life?
Yeah. When our young men came into the study, they thought, like most people still do when they're young, that they needed to get rich to have a good life, that they needed to get famous, they needed to win lots of awards to have a good life. And of course, what we found was that that wasn't true. Some people got rich, some people didn't, some people got famous, some didn't. That didn't predict who was going to be happy, and certainly didn't predict who was going to stay healthy. What we found, well, first of all, is that the work you do is so important that taking care of your body really matters. So the people who took care of their health, got regular exercise, ate well, got access to health care, those people lived on average 10 years longer than the people who didn't. But the thing that surprised us was that the people who stayed healthy and lived the longest were the people who had the warmest relationships with other people. And when we found that, we didn't believe it at first. So we thought, how could this be? I mean, okay, having good relationships could make you happy. That makes sense. But how could it get into your body and predict that you'd be less likely to get coronary artery disease, or that you'd be less likely to get arthritis, or that you would live longer? How could that possibly happen? And so we thought, well, maybe our data are just a fluke. And then other studies have found the same thing. And everything we talk about in our book is confirmed by other studies. Basically, we trust our findings more if we know that other researchers have confirmed what we're finding. Yeah. And including with people of color, with many more diverse samples.
Yeah, so powerful. Now, the question is why? Why are relationships such a huge influence on our health and longevity?
Yeah. The research is still going on, but we've spent the last 10 years in our study and trying to answer that question. Mm-hmm. The best thing we can say now, the best hypothesis with some good data, is that it's about stress, that good relationships seem to be stress relievers. And I'll explain. So, when something happens to us, you have a really upsetting thing happen during your day, you get a ticket, or some medical crisis happens, you can literally feel your body change. Your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up. It's called fight or flight mode. And we want our bodies to respond that way. But then when the threat is removed, we want our bodies to come back to baseline. And one of the things you'll notice is that, if you have something upsetting happen in your day and, you're thinking about it and you're upset about it, if you have somebody at the end of the day you can talk to about that, and you're able to talk to them, you can literally feel your body calm down and go back to that equilibrium. What if you don't have anybody you can talk to like that? And so we think what happens is that people who are more isolated, lonely, less connected, that those people stay in a kind of low-level fight or flight mode of chronic stress, higher levels of stress hormones circulating in their bodies, higher levels of inflammation all the time, breaking down body systems slowly but gradually. And so that's what we think is one of the main drivers of how relationships can either improve our health or the lack of good relationships can break it down.
That's so remarkable. And the thing is, even as you're saying this, it just experientially we know this, but to have the science to affirm it and to direct our attention to it, it's basically a buffer. It's a very powerful buffer against how we're processing and dealing with stress. And we'll put the study up for everybody to see on the screen. But An analysis recently found that upwards of 60 to 80% of all physician visits today are for stress-related illnesses.
Absolutely.
Right? Stress is tied into so many different things that can go wrong in the human body. But and just to be clear as well, it's not the absence of stress, because stress can get turned into a bad word as well, right? But it's our ability to properly assimilate, manage, grow from stress, hormetic stressors. You mentioned exercise and things like that. But overall, when we get into this place of chronic stress and not being able to deal with the stress,
Right.
and so our relationships basically make us stronger in the face of stress.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And what we hope is, as you say, that we have the chance to recover from stress, and also that we're not overwhelmed by challenges. That if we have challenges that we feel capable of meeting, that's great, and that fosters growth. If we have challenges that are overwhelming, we don't have ways of coping, and that's when stress becomes detrimental to our bodies.
So remarkable. So this being one of the major influences with our relationships, stress, right? And how we're associating with stress, how our bodies are processing stress. Is there anything else about relationships that seem to contribute to our longevity that you've got some little hints of?
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the things is that relationships and connections keep us wanting to be our best selves in the world. I mean, one of the things they often find is that men in particular are more likely to die shortly after their partners die. And the question is, why does that happen? Is it mystical? Is it? And one of the simpler explanations is that men often, as they're older, stop taking their medication. They stop eating as well because they don't have a partner there to say, did you take your pills today? They don't have a partner there to make sure they're eating decent food, right? And they're remembering to eat, right? And they're not drinking too much. And so in some ways, these connections in the most simple fashion keep us trying to be our best for each other.
Yeah, yeah. And in the context of men, I would think also that sense of purpose as well, living for her, providing service. But I would imagine obviously it's going to affect everybody.
Everybody, women too, absolutely. That part of what happens is we all want to feel like we matter somewhere in the world, right? And often the place we feel like we matter first is with each other, with our closest relationships. So what happens when the person you're closest to is not there anymore? And when we're lucky, we find new people to whom we can matter and they can matter to us.
Yeah. Now, here's the biggest question, right? We know that our relationships obviously have a huge influence on our lives, but I think we have this very romantic idea about relationships. You complete me and the whole thing, you know.
Yeah.
But what actually constitutes a good relationship? And I think it's going to be surprising for people because we think super smooth sailing, no problems.
No. In fact, we found that like many of our most stable couples fought like cats and dogs. But the difference, so it wasn't the amount of arguing you did. It wasn't even the amount of anger. What it was, when we actually watched couples on video having an argument, it was whether you could see a bedrock of affection and respect, even when people were arguing. So what we know about the best relationships is, first of all, there are always disagreements, always. And the question is, how do we manage those disagreements? Can we find ways to work out those inevitable conflicts? I want this and you want that. Always going to happen. The question is, can we find a way to work things out so that neither of us feels like we've won or lost, that we both feel okay about each other and ourselves when we emerge from working out a conflict? That's the key, not whether disagreements happen, because those are always going to happen.
All right. Now, we know that our relationships have the biggest influence on our health and longevity. Check. We know certain skill sets in relationships really help for that to be possible to have a successful relationship. My question is, why are we not taught this stuff? Why are we not taught how to actually communicate and connect with each other?
It's starting to happen. there is something called socio-emotional learning, which is just a fancy term in education for teaching kids about what feelings are like, how they happen, what is anger like, what is an argument with a friend, how can you work out a disagreement with a friend without resorting to a fist fight or without breaking off the relationship. And when kids get taught these things, literally in school, they do better in arithmetic. They do better at reading. They get into trouble less in school. They get into drugs less. If you teach children about their feelings, how to handle their feelings, and how to relate to other people more healthfully, kids do so much better, including in their academic subjects. And so, and there were these huge studies of thousands of kids who get these programs in school, and compared to the kids who don't get these programs in school, the kids who get this kind of teaching are so much better off.
Amazing. So is this constituting social fitness? Is this what
It is constituting. It's the kids' version of social fitness. And when we give these programs to teachers to have them teach to their students, the teachers will come back and say, you know, we need this for us too. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why we wrote the book, to kind of help people. Well, what does science really tell us about how to keep your relationships in good shape, how to stay socially fit?
We've talked over the years many, many times about physical fitness, obviously, but emotional fitness as well, financial fitness. You know, that's kind of what model health really is having fitness in all areas of life. But the one that stands above all of them that I think it's so difficult for us. And you even mentioned it, like you would see this in data, like this can't be right. But social fitness is the most important one. It affects all of this other stuff downstream.
Yep.
If we get our relationships right, it makes all this other stuff easier and more manageable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we use the term social fitness because we think it's a good analogy with physical fitness. So, you know, when we exercise today, you don't then come back home and say, I'm done. I don't ever have to do that again, right? Like it's something you need to keep doing. We think of exercise, of physical fitness, as a practice, as an ongoing practice. What we find is that taking care of our relationships needs to be that kind of ongoing practice that we pay attention to, so that you don't just, like, okay, when I was in my 20s and I'd made a bunch of friends at different times in my life, and I thought they're always going to be my friends. I don't have to worry about them. I can just go on and live my life. What we see is that perfectly good relationships can wither away and die just from neglect. So social fitness basically calls our attention to the idea that we need to be active. We need to make little tiny decisions day to day, week to week, to actively connect with each other, to reach out to a friend we haven't seen in a while, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it seems obvious, but I really appreciate this because we're bringing our awareness to it. And I love the analogy of physical fitness. And, you know, we do something a couple of times, we're like, all right, I'm done. When you said that, though, that's exactly what my wife did.
Yeah.
All right. When we met, because I was working at the university gym,
yeah.
And she came in, I just saw this woman. She was like very dedicated. She's over there, you know, working really hard. And, you know, when we started dating, I was like, oh, this is great. We're going to have this in common, whatever. Didn't come to the gym again for like a year, right? Because she was there because she was trying to get in shape for a girls trip, right?
Yeah.
And so she was done, right?
She was done.
But then you see the long tail effects of the various health ramifications, right? So not being in the shape that you want to be in or feeling how you want to feel and all the benefits that gets. But oftentimes we kind of pull the plug on it, or most importantly, or I think most prominently, we get caught up in the busyness of life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, your story about your wife is a good example of what may have happened, which is that she found a partner who valued physical fitness. And so I bet she has stayed more tuned into physical fitness because she's connected to you, right? And so what we find is that if we do have connections in our lives with people who have healthy habits, we're more likely to exercise those healthy habits ourselves.
Have you found that relationships tend to have a lot of compliments like that? Because she, on the other side, has helped me to loosen up a little bit, and
Oh,
enjoy
yeah.
things, that kind of stuff. I'm not, my personality type tends to not want to celebrate things or to take a moment to reflect. I have built in intentionally into my days, I have a gratitude practice, these things, but I'm very much wanting to create, wanting to grow, wanting to keep pushing the envelope. And
Yeah.
she helps me to bring it back. Like, look at what we've accomplished, or, take a moment, reflect, take it easy, relax,
Yeah.
So have you seen that in relationship context?
Yes, and it's one of the things I think that binds us together. So you realize that she does something for you that you probably wouldn't do for yourself. And she may realize the same thing about you, right? And so there's this sense of, oh, this person really offers me things that I wouldn't do on my own or can't do on my own. And that is so helpful. I mean, my co-author, Mark Schultz, is my friend, but he's also my research collaborator. He can do things in research that I can't begin to do. And so we have these ways of sort of being bonded to each other because we offer each other things that are unique to the relationship.
All right, so this is the big question. We're dealing with another person or other people, and unfortunately or fortunately, we can't control other people. So how much, being that this is such a huge influence on our happiness, how much of this is actually under our control?
Not a lot. We can control what we do, right?
Yeah.
And how we respond. You're pointing out something so important, which is that there are always two people, at least in any relationship, and two people who are each constantly changing. So we're all a moving target. And what that means is we need flexibility. We need to learn new dance steps with each other. I mean, one of my closest friends I've known since kindergarten. Now, we've changed a lot since kindergarten. And so we've had to kind of change our moves that we do with each other over time so that the relationship stays kind of vibrant and alive. And certainly when you're in an intimate partnership, absolutely. I mean, my wife isn't the same person she was when we got married 36 years ago. Neither am I. And what we've had to learn to do is adapt to each other. Oh, you're taking off on this new path. You're developing this new interest. How am I going to go along with that? How am I going to follow you there or not follow you there, but at least appreciate it? So it involves a lot of adaptation and flexibility, but that's good for us. It's good for our brains. It's good for our psyches to be that flexible.
Let's talk about the counter side and what you've seen in the data over the years with relationships that tend to not work out or to have a lot of friction.
Yeah. Well, some of it does have to do with inflexibility. So as one person changes, the other person says, I don't want you to change like that. That's not okay with me. And then they're stuck, not being able to figure out a way to be together. And so I think what we hope to encourage is that for the relationships we care about, that we adopt a kind of curiosity about who this person in my life is today. Not who they were yesterday, but who are they today? Especially with family members we grew up with. I mean, think about it. If you grew up with siblings, like you might have had an older sibling who you thought was always bossy. Well, maybe 20, 30 years later, that's not what's going on in your relationship. But what if you keep imagining that it is, right? So we have to bring that kind of curiosity to our ongoing relationships and say, okay, what's here now that I haven't seen before in you and in our relationship?
So fascinating. Now, if you could, because again, we don't get a lot of training on this, if at all. We're just kind of thrust into our relationships,
Yeah.
and our textbook is usually, Hollywood movies
I
on
know.
how it's supposed
I
to be,
know.
So having these skills, like you just mentioned, it's not an absence of conflict. And that's important. I think that's first and foremost a really important tenet for us to understand, right?
Yeah.
Because we have this romantic idea that we should just be, everything's peaceful, all this stuff. And not to say that we don't have peace as well, but in the face of inevitable conflict, I think you even said the word inevitable earlier.
Yeah.
In the face of an inevitable conflict, in those moments when it's happening, you mentioned a foundation of intimacy still existing.
Yes.
Right? So can we talk more about that? Like, what are some of the things that we can do personally when we're in a conflict with the person that we love and we care about, and for us to more gracefully handle these situations?
Yes. So first of all, when you feel anger come up or a sense of threat, oh, we're in a conflict, we disagree. The first thing is just to slow everything down if you can. Because one of the problems is we all want to react right away and make it go away. The conflict, the upset, the anger. And the hardest thing to learn, but the most useful, is to slow it down, to let your reaction come up and remember that it's going to pass away. You're not always going to be this upset. And even to say to your partner who you're having the conflict with, let's take a time out. Let's come back and talk about this later. I'm feeling really upset right now. It would be better for me to go away, calm down, and for us to talk about it again. And kids can do that too. Kids can do that with each other. We can do it with our kids. And so slowing things down is probably the first step when it's possible. And then also being curious rather than assuming that we know why somebody said what they said or did what they did. Just be curious. Okay, tell me, what made you say that? What were you thinking about? Or how come you did that? And not accusing, just curious. Because often the assumptions we make about somebody else turn out not to be true. But we can act on those assumptions and do all kinds of harm to everybody.
Yeah, and we start linking things together.
Yeah.
Like we might have and this is kind of like a longitudinal versus cross-sectional thing where we have a snapshot situation here that we're dealing with, but we relate it to this whole breadth of other things.
Yeah.
Right? Why do we do that?
And the worst thing you can say in an argument is you always or you never. Nobody always does anything. Nobody never does. It just doesn't, there's no always, there's no never. But what we do is we say, okay, it's always been like this. You always say those things, right? Mm-hmm. Not true. So one of the pointers is to just take this moment and this incident for what it is, not as some global confirmation of the eternal truth.
Yeah, we talk about this in my relationship with my wife about not speaking in extremes.
Yeah.
Right? Because we tend to do that, but to catch ourselves doing that.
Yeah.
And also something super valuable. It's not just for us to, I think awareness is so powerful, obviously, to be aware of how we're feeling and start to question ourselves, right? To be curious within ourselves too. But externally, yes, asking questions, being curious is so powerful to find more clarity because we come to our own assumptions and paint these whole stories. But also internally being curious about, for example, like if I'm having a conflict with my wife, my best friend, we love each other so much and just love being around each other. For me to be aware of like, what is her state? Like maybe she's being sensitive about a thing or, whatever the case might be. And just like, did she have a tough day? Did she stress? Whatever. For me to start to paint her in a better light rather than like somebody I'm a victim.
Right.
All of a sudden. Right. So what about that capacity to just be more, I guess that's that's an extension of compassion and understanding.
Yeah. And as you said, you have a gratitude practice. So one of the things, if you can bring yourself to do it in the moment, is to remember all the things you're grateful for about this person.
Wow. Yeah.
Like, wow, what if I never saw her again? Oh my gosh. Right. And so even though she's just made you mad, right? Yeah. The other thing, as you were saying, you can start to ask yourself questions like, what's upsetting me so much about this? Why am I getting so worried about this? If I think that she said something a little nasty. Okay, it happens. Why am I so upset right now? Because that's another way to just slow it down and to be more curious about what's going on.
Yeah. And this is what's so powerful and remarkable about us as a species. You know, we have the ability to do these
Yeah.
things, but I think what hinders us is just our desire to be right. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah. um, in my Zen practice, there's a saying: "Don't believe everything you think."
Mm,
And it basically, it's about that desire to be right. Well, I need to, I think this and it's right, and I'm going to show everybody. And actually, okay, there's another Zen quote that I'll use because I love this quote and it helps me a lot. Um, in Zen, we talk about beginner's mind, trying rather than to be right and to assume that you know what you're talking about, to bring that kind of awareness of there's so much I don't know about any situation,
yeah.
including my relationship with this person, right? It's called beginner's mind. And so the encouragement is bring a beginner's mind, a know nothing in the best sense mind, to your next encounter with somebody you see all the time. And the saying in Zen is, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So
Yeah.
if we think, well, I'm an expert in this person, you've kind of closed off a lot of possibility.
Yeah. The irony of it is, I think we tend to do that for certainty. You
Yeah.
know, the human brain just craving that certainty. You know, we know a certain thing, but it can create a lot of stress and tension and unhappiness, really, when we're attached to something that, we frame as something being so stagnant. And so now we're venturing into uncertainty when we come in with a beginner's mind, but we're
Yeah.
also opening ourselves up for so much beauty and discovery and just being actually being present with somebody,
Yes.
you know.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the things that I tend to do is I've thought over the years, like, I'll see how other people react to my kids, for example, right? And they're just like, oh, they're so they're so well behaved, or, there's just hanging out with friends, like they can see my son Braden, my youngest son, and just like they're so interested in him and like, seeing this happiness.
Yeah.
And I can miss it because
Mm.
I'm there with it all the
Mm.
time and we can
Mm.
get, acclimated to it.
Yeah.
And so one of my practices that I've employed is at least once a day, because especially again, the busyness of life is what tends to happen. But I'll pause and I will completely listen to him and listen to the sound of his voice and look at his eyes and the way that he's thinking and processing things. And I listen to the emotion in his voice. I just start to really pay attention to the subtle things. And it brings me right there.
Mm.
It's such a moment of beauty and presence. And I know it's going to affect him as well, right? To be seen. And that's what I found in your book throughout. Like, you didn't necessarily have to say it, but just the act of asking people questions. Some people were very surprised that you guys were even interested in them. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that and how just even making somebody feel seen and understood and listening to them can be cathartic.
Absolutely. People want to be seen. They want to feel like someone else knows them, gets them. Um, and one of the worries about particularly our current times is that we're so glued to our screens that it's harder and harder to do what you did with your son, to stop, to look, to pay attention to the tone of his voice, just the expression on his face, right? To pay that kind of total attention to someone. Um, One more Zen quote. One of my teachers said, attention is the most basic form of love. That if you really give somebody else your undivided attention, that's the most valuable thing we've got to give somebody else. And you were doing that with your son.
Yeah. Oh wow. I've never thought about this before, but I really do. I really do value when the people that I love like pay attention to me.
Yeah.
Because, I'm doing all this stuff in the world and obviously they can take it for granted, like, dad, he's strong and he's doing all this stuff. And also they can get in the busyness of their days and their lives as well. But today, my oldest son, I was, I come into the kitchen this morning, and this guy's always in there eating. It's like
Yeah.
it's from this movie Friday. It's like, when I'm in the kitchen, you in the kitchen, eating up all the food.
Right.
And so, he's working out in this whole thing. But he asked me, I just went to this gala yesterday, we talked about before the show, my friend Daniel Amen. And he asked me, what was your favorite part about the event? Right? And he was locked in on me. He really wanted to know.
Yeah.
And it made me feel so good. It's like,
Yeah.
this guy cares about me.
Yes. Yes. Well, and he asked such a good question. He didn't just say, how was the event? And you could have said, fine, right? End of conversation. He said, what was your favorite part? And we can do that with each other. A lot of times, if I would ask my kids, how was school? They'd say, fine,
Yeah.
end of story. But if I said, did anything surprising happen today? Or what was the thing you liked best today? Right? Just like your son asked you, it makes you stop to think, and it makes you then maybe offer something. And that leads to more of a conversation. So what a great thing he did.
It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Pretty remarkable. And I think it's culture as well, where these things start to manifest.
Yeah.
I caught this really early on with of course, with my kids, just asking them about their day. It's fine, good,
Right,
You're
right.
right. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna start asking a better question.
Yeah.
And so with my youngest son, like when I pick him up, I'll be like, any what did you learn today, right? Or any highlights for the day, or something unexpected happened, right? So I'll ask these different questions, and he'll talk the whole time, versus again these, well, it's cool, fine, whatever.
Right.
And so
Right.
this gets back to the power of questions.
Right. And the power of questions that convey that you're really interested, that you really want to know. We often ask each other, how are you? And so the response is fine. And that's it. And actually, when you get a different response, it's like a little bit of a shock. Like, oh no, what do I do with that? And so how can we make our questions reflect that we are truly interested, and we'd like a meaningful response if somebody's willing to give one.
Yeah. In the book, you also talk about some of the myths about happiness. And one of those is that happiness is an accomplishment, essentially. It's something that we can basically achieve, like a certificate or something. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yes. This idea that, if I just get these things in my life, if I buy the right stuff, right? If I get the right partner, if I live in the right place, that each of those things will somehow set me up for good. The truth is, happiness comes and goes for all of us. Nobody is happy all the time. And it's really important to name that, because when we look at somebody else's Instagram feed, for example, we can think they're having the best life ever. They've got it all figured out, and they're happy all the time. Because we curate what we show each other.
Yeah.
I don't post the pictures of myself when I wake up in the morning feeling depressed or dreading the future. I post the pictures where I'm happy and I'm in a nice place. And so what we want to do is be much more aware of the ways that we compare our insides to other people's outsides.
Yeah. All right. This is when this study was started, obviously they had no conception of social media.
No.
Was not even remotely like an inkling of an idea in the cosmos, right? But
Right.
today, this is what we have. And I even put social in quotes now mentally, right? Now, obviously there's a perspective we could take that it's a neutral medium, right? We can use it for purposes based on our perception and our values and these things. However, we know now today that there are brilliant engineers who are working behind the scenes to make these things very sticky, to even essentially our attention span has just been dwindling away because we're looking for that next like hit of neurochemicals,
Right.
And this addictive quality to it. And also all the negativity that we're constantly going to be exposed to as well. The divisiveness, we're getting fed what keeps us in the same perspective, same ideals, that kind of thing. And we can start to think in a silo. We were talking about this before the show
Yeah.
earlier, you and I, and this landscape and something very complex with social media. So, and my question for you would be, knowing that our relationships are really the most vital part of our longevity, of our health, how can we deal with this brand new medium, this new exposure that kids are being born into today?
Right, right. And the fact is, screens are not going to go away. So it doesn't work to say, well, screens are bad, we should just be done with them. Not going to happen. But there's some research on this now. There's some research that shows that how we use our screens and how we use social media matters big time for whether we feel worse or better from using it. So what they are finding is that when we use social media actively, so when we reach out to people, connect with people, that actually turns out to be energizing and it increases our well-being. So for example, there are people during the pandemic who reconnected with friends from elementary school, who they hadn't been in contact with in a long time. And they've started having weekly Zoom calls, with their elementary school friends. And they absolutely love it. Okay? So that's an active connection that's energizing and uplifting. On the other hand, we could spend our time looking at somebody else's social media feed, seeing all the beautiful pictures they post, feeling like we're missing out, like we're not living our best life, and they are, and we're not. What we do is it sets the stage for comparison, and we compare ourselves negatively by this passive consumption of other people's social media. That makes us feel worse. So what I might suggest to your audience is watch what happens when you spend, say, 10, 20 minutes in a particular way online, and check in with yourself. How does my body feel? How does my mind feel after I've spent time here? Is my energy lower? Am I more closed off? Am I more down? Or am I more uplifted? And if you're more down and more closed off, steer away from those places and those activities online.
Yeah. This goes back to something we talked about earlier as well, which is awareness, the ability to, in those moments, check in with yourself. And it's a skill, like, again, and you know this obviously from all the work that you've done. Nobody's perfect. We're going to stumble. We're going to fall into these traps from time to time. So in a relationship, when we're in a tense moment, we're not always going to be able to just reel ourselves back in and ask the right questions, check in with ourselves. But as you build that muscle, right? So it's social fitness.
Exactly.
Again, it's the same thing of being able to, in those moments of tension, can you just step out, take a meta perspective for a moment, or even go more within and ask questions and build that muscle and just understand you're not a victim in these moments. You have agency.
Right, right. And there are ways that we can build these skills. Like we have exercises in the book, and there are a lot of ways that you can get better at these things. Many people will say to me, I'm no good at relationships. Like they don't work out for me, and I'm never going to have good relationships. It's too late for me. And one of the things that all these life stories show us from our study, it's never too late. I mean, there are some people who find a tight group of friends for the first time in their 60s or 70s. There are some people who find love in their 80s for the first time. So if you think you can't do this, think again. It's not true.
I love it. So powerful. So powerful. Well, throughout the book, you share a variety of stories, coming from people who've been participating in the study. And I don't want to give any parts of this away, but just the opening part of the book, you share the story of Henry and Rosa. And I don't want you to say anything but I would just want to share that going through that story really hit me. And I shared I was getting choked up just even in the setup of the question that was being posed to them and their answers. And for a nonfiction book to hit me like that was just so unexpected. And, we can see ourselves in other people. And that's the point that I want to bring, because the reason it hit me is you ask them, or your colleague asks them about the greatest fear that they have, and I shared that fear, and I didn't realize until I read those words. And again, the power of questions is so remarkable. The questions that we pose ourselves, the questions that we pose other people, in a sense, questions are the answer oftentimes in our lives. And so what are some of the steps for us to start to intentionally construct a good life? Because again, I want to circle back to the point of a good life does not mean that you're not going to have stresses and struggles and challenges,
Right.
but that's part of the ingredients, I think. But what are some of the things that we can start to do intentionally for us to cultivate better relationships and to start to consciously create a good life?
Maybe the first thing people can do is to take stock of their relationships. Like, what do I have in my relationships right now that I'm happy about? You know, one of the things we know is that relationships provide us with all kinds of different things, and different relationships give us different things. So, some people we have fun with, right? We party with, or we play sports with, or do whatever. Some people who help us with practical matters. I have a neighbor who always has the right tools, and I always have the wrong tools for anything I'm trying to fix in my house. And so, he's like the guy I can call who will come and help me fix something, right? Yeah. There are people who give us rides to the doctor. There are people who we can confide in when my kid does something and I'm really scared about it and I need somebody to talk to. Okay, so there are all these. So what people can do is they can take stock. What kind of support am I getting from different relationships? And also, what kind of support am I giving in return, hopefully, that it's mutual? And then think, well, what would I like more of? And how might I have more of that? So maybe I could have more people who I could just spend leisure time with and have fun with because I work too hard. Well, could I do more of that with people who are already in my life? Or are there some new people who I could just test the waters with? Like maybe ask somebody to go for a walk, or, just try it out with somebody who I like but don't know very well. And so the first step is to see if you can strengthen relationships you already have. And another is to see, well, who might I like to get to know better? And be active. So it won't happen by itself. Reach out to somebody. Just, simple actions like sending somebody a text. Hey, I was thinking of you and wondered if you'd ever want to grab a cup of coffee. Something like that. Simple. We won't always get a positive response. So sometimes it doesn't work, but you would be amazed at the number of times when people are thrilled to be asked to connect, right? And so I would say think about ways you could be active. It doesn't have to be big, little ways that could have big ripple effects in improving your relationships.
That's such good advice. Yeah. Just taking time, take stock of your friendships and relationships. Now, with that said, you might happen upon a relationship if you actually are being honest about it. Not that, because people like to throw the word toxic around, toxic relationships. Sometimes you're the toxic person yourself,
Yeah.
But something that, if you are being honest with yourself is, constantly, abusive or dangerous or hurtful or just pulling away a lot of life force versus adding to it. When we see that, do we have permission to maybe let that go?
Yes. First, see what's possible. So some relationships are so important that we don't want to give up easily. Let's say you're in a relationship where you two have children together, or you two run a business together, or any number of things where you've invested together in something. Those are the relationships where we want to work hard to see, is it possible to improve things? But sometimes it isn't. And if it's not, it's really important to step away. So the first question is, how much do I have at stake here? The second is, are there ways we could improve this? And then the third is, if it can't be improved, is it time to walk away?
Yeah. And I think obviously that's a very difficult decision. But here's the bright side of that, of course, is making room
Yeah,
when you do that. And it's not even just the room for physical presence of another person, but just the mental and emotional energy that you are able to claim back can
absolutely.
be a game changer.
Exactly. So saying no opens up possibilities to new things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I want to circle back because, again, we're living at this time of, quote, social media. I'm still going to put in quotes.
Yeah.
But again, I'm out there, I'm sharing stuff on social media, but if people even are following me, for example, I'm at Shawn Model on Instagram, they'll notice that I'm not just sharing these bright and beautiful moments. I'm actually digging into very challenging topics a lot of times as well,
Yeah.
and talking about our society's dependency now on this kind of pharmaceutical model and not being able to, work through tools for, understanding our bodies, understanding our minds and stuff that you're talking about. Again, like giving these tools to children so we can start to churn out happier, healthier people, and
Right.
not try to fix problems down the line, right? So I'm digging into these things that can be uncomfortable. It can even be controversial a little bit sometimes, unfortunately, which is so silly because we know the ingredients that create health. But we talked about this earlier as well. We're constantly being manipulated as well
Right.
to kind of think the way that the prevailing narrative, right, the prevailing belief of society, which is there's a lot of money being made on the farming of sick people, people that
That's
feel
right.
lost and disconnected.
That's right.
And so you're directing people back to ourselves, back to our relationships, stacking conditions in our favor,
Right.
right? So my question is, in this social media paradigm, can you talk about one of the key ingredients that's missing, which is social feedback, right? Being able to actually connect with a person in the real world, to see their facial expressions, like all of this data gets lost. And I know probably a huge percentage of people listening have had conflicts online that could just take over their life,
Oh,
take over their minds.
right.
So let's talk about that.
That's so important. I'm really glad you brought this up because, I mean, I've had this happen where I get an email that looks to me like they're angry at me, and then I start getting angry back, or I get defensive or something, right? And then I realize if I just pick up the phone and talk to somebody, hear their voice, ask, okay, tell me about this. What were you thinking? Often everything calms right down, right? There's something about communication electronically that filters out most of the important stuff, like nuance and tone of voice and often intention, where you have all these chances to quickly ask a follow up question. So it's really key that if you find yourself starting to get into some kind of conflict with somebody online, take it offline really fast. Talk to them and don't engage. If you're engaging with anonymous people and having conflicts, step away. That goes nowhere.
Yeah, it's silly.
Yeah.
It's silly, and a lot of times it could even be an anonymous egg. Like if it's on
Yeah.
Twitter for some reason,
It
but
could
it's
be a
because,
bot.
yeah, like we want to defend our intentions and purpose and all these things, but the reality is when we don't have that social feedback, that real world connection, you know, it presents an opportunity. There's this landscape that takes away the humanness of it,
Right.
right? And so we start to behave in ways that we would never behave in the real world with real people. It starts to like take away our ability to actually see the person in a
Right.
sense. And that can be happening from the people that might be throwing conflict your way.
Right. And to see the person and have some compassion for the person. So if I said something mean to you right now, I'd have to see your reaction. I'd have to see your face. I don't want to do that. Whereas if I say something mean online, well, yeah, I don't have any
You can
consequences,
go eat a
right?
bowl of cereal right after.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, it's these are different things. These are different obstacles that we're facing today,
Yeah.
and we're trying to figure it out. But the most important thing that I'm really hearing is for us to, again, realize we have agency, to be able to be able to have a perspective of like, this isn't really even that valuable for us to invest in, versus the things that are valuable. And when we invest in those things and all of the ROI that comes from investing in the relationships that really matter, it can be absolutely transformative.
Yes. Yes.
Well, this has been one of my favorite conversations, and this book is so important. We were talking before the show that this coming out at this time I don't feel it's an accident. Like, we really need this right now.
Unfortunately.
We have, epidemic proportions of divisiveness.
Yeah.
And so what is your mission with this book? Why did you decide to write it and to put this information out right now?
I decided to do this because we know things. Science tells us things that we've been publishing in journals for years, but they're journals that most people don't have access to. And so it feels so important to me that people get these messages, what science tells us about the importance of human connection. I mean, as you say, now more than ever. So my passion is to get these messages out everywhere I can. And so actually, I'm really grateful for you letting me come and talk with you about this, because it's just one more way to tell people about this.
Yeah. There's a recipe, and that's one of the things you shared with me earlier was, they're seeing this huge database. We have some predictability about certain things, certain ingredients in a life that creates a good life.
Yeah.
And these don't have to be complex, but accessibility is important. But first of all, it's the awareness. And you're just transforming things by bringing this awareness to us. And I'm so grateful for you, because I didn't share this with you earlier, but one of the reasons that I stepped away from, when I went to college, I was like, I'm going to go pre-med and be a doctor and all these things. But I just never felt comfortable with this obsession with problems, studying disease. And even seeing my classmates would start to like self-diagnose, and like everything was just revolving around things that go wrong.
Right.
And for me, I'm so passionate about teaching people and studying what creates wellness, what makes a happy, healthy human being. And health is not the absence of disease. And a good life isn't the absence of problems.
That's right. That's right.
So
I love that. Yeah.
Can you let everybody know where they can pick up your book, and also just get into your world and follow your work?
Sure. So there's a book website, thegoodlifebook.com. There's you can get it on Amazon, at Barnes and Noble. There's an audiobook. You can look at some of our scientific papers. If you go to our study website, it's called adultdevelopmentstudy.org. And I'm around a little bit on social media, but not too much.
Not just a dabble.
Just a dabble.
Using it how I believe is best right now, which is as a supplement.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Versus being the real food, which is being in the real world, connecting. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
So there's different types of intelligence, there's different types of learning, but when you have a school system that has reduced learning and teaching down to only one type, you dismiss and you don't pull the gifts out of the children